So, welcome everyone to the 1 p.m. Benzodiazepines, the Beauty, the Beast, and the Butterfly session. Attendees who want to receive credit need to type their name in the chat and indicate what type of credits they're looking for. Please be sure to complete the session evaluations. The link to the evaluation is in the chat. It will be posted a couple more times throughout the session. To obtain your certificates, you will be sent an attendance form after the conference to complete and return via email to Teresa. Your certificate of attendance will be emailed to you once all sessions have been verified. Also, in the link in the chat, in the chat, you will find a link to our YVM survey, which is open to anyone 13 to 30, and our policy survey, which is attendee. Now, please welcome Renee Schulz-Jacobson and Kristen Sullivan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Renee Schulz-Jacobson and also Kristen there in our talk about benzodiazepines today. Over the last 8 years, people have tried to convince me that the horrific experience that I had coming off of clonazepam is unusual and that it was like truly a freak accident. And as much as I wish this were the case, unfortunately, Kristen's and my stories are not at all unique. In fact, thousands of people all over the world have been injured while taking and or coming off of benzodiazepines. Next slide. Oh, first slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to be talking about benzodiazepines, the beauty, the beast, and the butterfly. And I'll explain what that's about. Next slide, please. So part one is the beauty. And before we get into our personal stories, Kristen and I thought it would be helpful to understand what some commonly benzodiazepines are, the history of benzodiazepines, where they came from, who uses them, and why. So this part of the presentation is the history and the promise of benzodiazepines. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about benzodiazepines, there are many, many, many of them, but some of the more commonly prescribed benzos include things like Xanax, Klonopin, Valium, Ativan, and Restorol. And you can see those are the brand names that were up there on the screen, but there are also the more formal names. And if you'll notice them, I think the slide went down there. But when the slide goes back up, you'll notice that many benzodiazepines end in LAM or PAM. And I like to point that out to people because it's not always the case that they end in LAMs and PAMs, but I do like to just point it out because in case someone sees that they're being given a script for something that ends in a LAM or a PAM, it's a good idea to make sure you know what you're taking there. Next slide. And if we can keep these slides up there, that would be super helpful, Jen. Thank you. One more. Thank you. So I want to tell a little bit about the history of benzodiazepines. So today, benzodiazepines are the pharmaceutical companies, industry's top-selling family of prescription drugs, with an estimated 94 million benzodiazepine prescriptions dispensed from U.S. outpatient retail and mail-order pharmacies. They were never supposed to be taken long-term, and this did not happen overnight. Nearly a century ago, German chemists developed a class of sedatives known as barbiturates, and they were the first synthetic tranquilizers. German pharmaceutical companies marketed those barbiturates under various names, and their popularity exploded in the United States during the Great Depression in the 1930s, when everyone was going through so much financial turmoil. People were losing their homes, their businesses, their livelihoods, and the over-the-counter barbiturates helped millions of Americans to take the edge off by reducing brain activity and depressing the central nervous system. But as you can see, by 1941, 1 billion barbiturates had sold over the counter, and with doctors and pharmacists assured customers that the pills were completely harmless, but patients were starting to experience some problems. But patients were constantly reassured that the drug makers say that these drugs are safe and that there were no risks. So while the barbiturates did help many people get to relax and get sleep, they also produced tolerance and dependence and carried a very high risk of overdose. In the 1950s, Congress passed a law requiring physicians' approval for barbiturates, so they were no longer going to be available over the counter because there were so many overdoses. So the pharmaceutical companies, seeing that there was a huge opportunity, frankly, for them, they went to town trying to develop new drugs to meet the demand for more chill pills. So in 1955, a chemist at Hoffman La Roche synthesized the first benzodiazepine. The company called it Librium, and it hit the market in 1960. Now, this new drug worked on similar transmitters as the barbiturates, and to similar effect. They still depress the central nervous system and produce that desired sense of calm. The drug makers said that the drugs were a completely safe breakthrough in modern medicine. And then Hoffman La Roche went on to develop another one, another benzodiazepine, which was diazepam, or the soon-to-be famous Valium. And sales of this new drug quickly went through the roof, especially because they were marketed really to women and busy men who are having supposedly like psychic pain. And sidebar, I just learned this the other day, that Arthur Sackler of the Purdue Sacklers, of the OxyContin Sacklers, was actually in charge of marketing Valium and Librium, which made $2 billion for La Roche. Just to note that, because he was the uncle of Richard Sackler, who went on to do all this for the Purdue brothers and OxyContin. Anyway, once again, with the Valium stuff, despite the industry assurances about safety and low profiles for addiction and reports of difficult withdrawal came to the surface and began to tarnish Valium's reputation during the 1970s. So the industry once again decided it was an opportunity to rebrand and decided they were going to create a new generation of tranquilizers with new names. So in 1975, La Roche began marketing clonazepam, which goes by the name of Klonopin. And in 1977, Wyeth Pharmaceuticals released Ativan. Now, at this point, drug makers stopped using the term tranquilizer, and they started using a new umbrella term called anxiolytic, suggesting that benzodiazepines were an entirely, that these new drugs were an entirely new class of drugs with different neurochemistry. They were not. They did change it so that benzodiazepines typically have a lower profile for overdose, but they still provided all those, hit the same neurotransmitters. And the other thing that was a little bit different was that these new drugs had lower dosages, which masked the new drugs' dramatically increased potency. So what I mean by that is a milligram of clonazepam or Klonopin equals roughly 10 to 15 milligrams of Valium. So when someone is taking something like 1 milligram or 0.5 or 0.25 milligrams of that drug, it doesn't sound like it's very much, right? It sounds like you're taking a tiny amount, which was also not true. And by the way, this conversion is also true for Xanax. Patients thought they were taking small amounts of a drug when in fact these were very, very potent drugs. In the same time, in the 1980s, pharmaceutical companies began to have more influence in the education of young medical students. So young, impressionable medical students were taught that patients presenting with anxiety or depression or panic, they have a chemical imbalance. It was a lie, but it was an effective lie. So suddenly, when a patient would present with anxiety or depression, or they say that they have someone they're suffering from an illness or an injury, bereavement, a divorce, or just some trauma, general trauma, instead of talking to friends or family members or going to the source of the problem, instead of maybe going to a clergy member, as people might have done previously, now people were encouraged to seek help from medical professionals. And the pharmaceutical companies or the pharmaceutical representatives impressed upon these young emerging doctors that there was no need for people to suffer anymore, that now there is truly a pill for every ill, and it's all about finding the right cocktail or mix of medications, patients were told. At the same time, during the 80s, many industrialized countries began to strictly regulate the non-emergency use of benzodiazepines. So they were noticing some problems over in the UK. There was a huge class action suit where 14,000 patients sued the makers of benzodiazepines for knowingly downplaying and withholding information to patients about their harm potential. The US Food and Drug Administration knew about these claims and knew about this class action suit, but they chose not to investigate these claims, even though there were many, many reports from people having trouble with side effects of the drugs and also problems coming off of them. In 1990, the American Psychiatric Association finally, this is like 10 years after the report started, they launched a task force to investigate the dangers of rising benzodiazepine prescriptions. And by 2000, the APA found that up to 80% of people taking benzodiazepines could experience withdrawal upon cessation, and a leading medical expert on benzodiazepine withdrawal estimated that roughly 1 in 6 could suffer from an extreme form of protracted withdrawal that could last over 2 years. Next slide, please. While this information comes out, the drug makers begin to get a little bit nervous, and they release a new drug or new drugs. And these are the Z drugs. And I'm sure many of you have heard about these. These are the quote unquote sleep aids. They are FDA approved for short-term for insomnia, and sometimes even prescribed off-label for restless leg syndrome or other kinds of muscular issues. Some of those names would be Lunesta, Sonata, and Ambien. There are many, many more. And while they're not identical to benzodiazepines, the Z drugs work on similar brain chemistry and produce similar risks and adverse effects. So now we're looking in the 1990s when drug reps were handing out free samples of these drugs to practitioners, encouraging doctors to try them and reassuring doctors that they were safe for patients to use. Next slide, please. Finally, in 2016, I mean, this is decades later, the FDA issues a black box warning against combining benzodiazepines with opiates. Now, this happened because of the oxycodone epidemic or the opioid epidemic, because patients might have gone into their doctor, they've blown out their shoulder, they've blown out their back, they have an injury, and the doctor has now prescribed them an opioid for their pain, but they can't sleep at night, right? They have insomnia. So the doctors were also giving them benzodiazepines so that they could sleep. Well, because both drugs depress respiratory function and affect central nervous system function, many people were overdosing. So this is 2016, where finally the FDA was starting to pay attention. So they put this new black box warning. But this black box warning was not necessarily, it didn't quite get it all right. It acknowledged that patients can become, it basically acknowledged that benzodiazepines should not be prescribed concurrently with opioids because there's a high risk of overdose. But that's really all that it said in 2016, and it didn't really address any of the other issues about, tolerance and withdrawal and all those kinds of things that were, really just as big of a problem. So in 2020, and I think we're to the next slide, please. Oh, I guess, yeah, next slide. Thank you. So the risk factors of combining benzos and opioids, like I said, it's unsafe because they both suppress breathing and impair cognitive function. The CDC research revealed that over 90% of all benzo overdose deaths from 2019 to 2020 involved co-use of opioids and benzos. And the British Journal of Medicine found that 2,400 veterans who died of opioid overdoses, 49% were taking benzos concurrently. So those are pretty serious statistics. So next slide, please. So in 2020, during the height, or actually in 2019, there was another shift to the FDA guidelines, and it was noted that 94 million prescriptions were dispensed from the US outpatient pharmacies, with most patients having been prescribed benzos for years rather than the recommended 4-week maximum. So what also happened in 2019 is they changed their guideline to say that these drugs should not be prescribed for longer than 4 weeks. And so that's 2019. And then in the midst of the 2020 COVID-19 quarantine, the FDA then changed their FDA guidelines again. And this was a dramatic reversal and update. So the US Food and Drug Administration made a major admission about benzodiazepine drugs and acknowledged, number one, patients can become physically dependent after taking them for as little as several days. They acknowledge that stopping the drugs abruptly or reducing the dosage too quickly can cause severe withdrawal reactions, including seizures, which can be life-threatening. And they acknowledge that there can be severe withdrawal side effects that can last from weeks to years. Sorry. Next slide. So the question then becomes, who exactly is taking benzodiazepines? If there's 94 million, chances are either you're taking one or somebody you know is taking one or more. So in the statistics from 2016 reported that more than 10% of women and 6% of men aged 64 to 80 were filling at least one benzo prescription in a 1-year period. So that's the geriatric patient or the senior citizen demographic, where that's a pretty significant. And then 1/3 of these seniors received benzodiazepines for longer than 120 days. So now remember, this was in 2016 prior to the updated black box warning, but since COVID, they are reporting that the prescriptions for benzodiazepines went up by 34%. So it stands to reason that these numbers have probably increased. A newer statistic comes from about children, and it's most alarming. Between 2000 and 2015, pediatric benzo prescriptions increased by 54%. With 1.2 million children being prescribed benzodiazepines for longer than a few days. And as you can imagine, this is significant because our brains do most of their changing and growing between birth and 25 to 26 years old. And there is a belief now, or maybe a better word is an understanding, that the earlier people are exposed to any kind of drug or mood-altering chemical, the less resilience they exhibit later when faced with a similar set of stressful circumstances, which is to say that people tend to go looking for the drugs that help them in the first place. So exposing children to these drugs is really serious. Next slide, please. What is bringing people to benzodiazepines? So I'm of the mindset that most people come to benzodiazepines, or at least long-term benzodiazepine use, as a result of trauma. There's trauma or neglect or abuse in there. That's what my that's an opinion, but I've talked to so many hundreds of people at this point, and every single one of them has acknowledged either physical trauma or emotional trauma. So as I said before, some people come to long-term benzodiazepine use because they are having seizures, and benzos are known to depress seizure activity. They are used, as we said, sometimes for pain. They can be used for tinnitus, for vertigo, or muscle tension. It's very common for someone to be prescribed a benzodiazepine for a facial tic or restless leg syndrome. And I gotta tell you, I just found out yesterday, this is crazy. I just found this out yesterday that benzos are being prescribed for the quote unquote long haulers with COVID because they have so many uncomfortable symptoms. I've just learned that doctors are actually prescribing them for some of that as well. A second reason that brings people to benzodiazepines, and what brought me to benzodiazepines, had to do with emotional, well, it's a combo of emotional and physical trauma. But that can be things like depression, anxiety, panic attacks, insomnia, and a newer one is that I actually know several clients, because I actually work as a coach for people coming through this injury. I've had several, and by several I mean at least 10 people tell me that they were prescribed benzodiazepines because they had come out as either homosexual or trans, and their doctor gave them benzodiazepines to ease their psychic pain and to try and get them to reduce their sexual urges or to depress just who they are. I mean, their identity. So that's a really interesting one. And then there is a third category of people who find their way to benzodiazepines long term, and that is sort of the recreational users. Sometimes people are experimental, and that experimentation can lead to abuse. Those are people who find the drugs, out of somebody else's medicine cabinet, or they're just kind of getting them off the street. And in my mind, it doesn't matter. I mean, the most important point of this, it doesn't matter what brought you to benzodiazepines, but it is important to understand that if you are taking benzodiazepines long term, you are causing harm to your brain. Chemicals produced in the brain, such as serotonin and dopamine, are reduced. And the benzos act quickly, right? They help to calm anxiety, but long term, they are not a cure for anxiety. They are simply masking whatever the problem is that you probably should be presenting with. It may reduce your somatic symptoms, but it will not help to manage the underlying cause that brings people to these medications in the first place. Next slide, please. Why are benzos so popular? So as I just said, benzos are popular because they work, right? They calm, they sedate. If you have restless legs, your legs will be calm. If you have a tic, it will relax. If you have insomnia, you will sleep. And that's the allure of these drugs, is that they work. They work exactly as promised until they don't. And my father always said there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? And with benzodiazepines, honestly, while they might work short term, there eventually comes a point where the user will have to pay for these easy benefits. So now I'm going to turn things over to Kristen, who's going to talk about the dark side of benzodiazepines, because this is really where things go awry for people.
Thanks, Renee. And that's exactly what I'm going to talk about, some of the long-term effects, and also how patients can most safely get off the drugs that they become dependent on. So it's estimated that approximately 50% of people who use benzos for over 6 months experience some sort of withdrawal symptoms. And the long-term use can lead to damage in the brain, in internal organs, and also to the muscular system. There's literally hundreds of side effects that have been documented by patients. Some of the most common are agitation, confusion, disassociation, depersonalization, racing pulse, constipation, sweating, akathisia, and sensitivity to light and sound. And I'm going to give a few examples as I walk through these things. When I was actually going through withdrawal, the first thing I did was I papered my windows in my bedroom with aluminum foil. And I needed to do that because I couldn't have any light in the room. And then there were those tiny little dots on the television and the DVR that were red that indicated they had power. And all of a sudden, those were as big as traffic lights that were sitting in my bedroom. So I had to tape over those. So I had to really had to stay in my room pretty much at all times. And I would sit and I would rock myself and I would pace because I had akathisia and I really needed to be in motion constantly. Ironically, some of the very symptoms that these drugs were prescribed for are often aggravated by taking the drugs themselves. So for example, a person who experienced depression may over time become more depressed as a result of using the drug. Maybe somebody who didn't suffer from insomnia and could sleep fine would finally end up having that symptom themselves. So some of those other ones includes panic and anxiety, seizures, and tremors. Many people experience crippling effects such as agoraphobia, where they can't leave their home, hallucinations, and muscle weakness. And very often they're not able to perform daily activities like holding a job, taking care of a household, providing for their families, or even driving a car. Next slide. Okay, benzodiazepine side effects can be especially debilitating because people experience many of the symptoms at the same time. So patients and doctors will look to address each symptom individually, partially because they don't understand that it could be coming from the drug itself. I currently work with a client who has 20 different medical specialists that she sees on a regular basis. She has a cardiologist, 2 GI specialists, a dermatologist, 2 dentists, an optometrist, 2 physical therapists, a psychiatrist, and it goes on and on. It's pretty much her full-time job just to keep track of her appointments, medications, and treatments. In reality, many of her illnesses could be a direct result of her withdrawing from these medications. However, she's on a 2.5-year taper schedule. So that means that she needs to treat almost every symptom individually because she's in so much pain and discomfort. Hopefully, though, when the drug is eventually out of her system, most of these issues will resolve themselves, but in reality, only time will tell. Next slide. The damage caused by using benzos are referred to as iatrogenic injuries. These are complications that occur to a person when they are as a direct result of getting medical treatment. So you can think of a person who is a cancer patient and has significant side effects from getting radiation or chemo treatments. And those are the very treatments that are supposed to be helping the patient to get rid of the cancer, but it's also damaging them as well. There's no telling how long patients will feel these side effects. Sometimes people only experience them for short term, like days or months, and others deal with the symptoms for years, and some even have symptoms that last permanently. Currently, there's no substitution medications that effectively act to minimize any of the withdrawal symptoms. But many people do find diet, exercise, and lifestyle changes helpful to managing their side effects. There's also coping techniques that people use, such as getting plenty of rest, avoiding caffeine and alcohol, limiting stress, relaxation techniques, asking others for help, which is a big one, joining support groups, or using cognitive behavior therapy. Next slide. So, what influences the severity of symptoms? Obviously, how much of a dosage is taken and the length of use are factors. However, these are not always indicative of how the withdrawal process will present itself. I have spoken with many people who have used the drugs for only a matter of days or weeks and still suffer from severe protracted withdrawal. In fact, one client I was seeing only was prescribed the medication because she was having an MRI and she felt that she was going to be anxious during that treatment or that testing. So she took benzos for about 6 days and ended up having to do a 3-year taper, which did not end very well for her. Okay, another consideration is how many different benzos are taken. I was prescribed originally Restorol for insomnia. I was coming off of, I was going through alcohol